Dominic Hale had everything: wealth, power, and control. But one stormy night he let a mysterious woman into his home. When she emerged from the shower, clean and transformed, he realized she wasn't just beautiful, she was hiding something. Who was she really? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Rain pounded against the windows of Dominic Hale's office on the top floor of Hale Industries. Lightning flashed across the night sky, illuminating his stern face as he stared at the city below. At 45, he had everything money could buy: a successful business empire, a mansion overlooking the city, luxury cars, and a reputation that made people both fear and respect him. "Mr. Hale," his assistant Margaret called from the doorway, "it's nearly midnight. Perhaps you should head home." Dominic turned, his expression unchanged. "I still have work to do." "You always have work to do," Margaret said with a sigh. After 15 years as his assistant, she was one of the few people who could speak freely to him. "The storm is getting worse. The weather service has issued warnings." Dominic glanced at the stack of contracts on his desk. "Fine, I'll finish these at home." The drive to his estate took longer than usual due to the storm. His driver, Frank, navigated the slick roads carefully while Dominic reviewed documents. On his tablet, when they approached the gates of his property, something caught his eye. "Stop the car," he ordered. Frank hit the brakes. "Is something wrong, sir?" Dominic squinted through the rain-streaked window, near the stone wall that surrounded his estate. A figure huddled under a large oak tree. It was a person, someone trying to find shelter from the storm. "Wait here," Dominic said, grabbing an umbrella from the car. He stepped out into the rain, his expensive shoes immediately soaking in a puddle. As he approached the tree, he saw it was a woman. She wore an oversized, tattered coat that seemed to swallow her small frame. Her head was bowed, dark wet hair hiding her face. "You can't stay here," Dominic said loudly over the rain. The woman looked up, startled. Even through the dirt on her face and the tangled mess of her hair, Dominic could see the quiet dignity in her tired eyes. Something about those eyes made him pause. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice surprisingly clear and refined. "I'll move on." As she tried to stand, she stumbled. Dominic instinctively reached out to steady her. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel her shivering. "Where are you going to go in this weather?" he asked. She looked away. "I'll find somewhere." For reasons he couldn't explain, Dominic made a decision that was completely out of character. "Come with me." The woman hesitated, suspicion clouding her face. "Look," Dominic said impatiently, "I'm offering you shelter for the night, food, a chance to get warm and dry. That's all." After a moment, she nodded and followed him to the car. Frank's eyes widened when he saw them approach, but he quickly masked his surprise and opened the door. The woman hesitated before sliding into the leather seat, clearly conscious of her wet, dirty clothes. "Take us home, Frank," Dominic said as he got in. The rest of the short drive to the house was silent. When they pulled up to the grand entrance of the Hale mansion, the woman stared through the window, her expression unreadable. Inside, Mrs. Collins, his housekeeper, was waiting despite the late hour. "Mr. Hale, we were getting worried with this storm." She stopped short when she saw the woman behind him. "Mrs. Collins, please prepare a guest room," Dominic said, "and find some dry clothes." "Of course, sir," Mrs. Collins replied, recovering quickly. She had worked for Dominic long enough to know not to ask questions. Turning to the woman, who stood dripping on the marble floor, Dominic gestured to the grand staircase. "You can shower and change. Mrs. Collins will show you to a room." "Why are you doing this?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic frowned, unsure of the answer himself. "Consider it an act of charity, nothing more." While Mrs. Collins led the woman upstairs, Dominic went to his study and poured himself a glass of scotch. The rain continued to pound against the windows as he tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting to the stranger upstairs. What had possessed him to bring a homeless woman into his home? It was completely unlike him. An hour later, a soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Collins entered with a tray of food. "I thought you might be hungry, sir. And your guest has finished settling in. I've put her in the blue room." "Thank you, Mrs. Collins. How is she?" "Cleaned up and in fresh clothes, sir. She didn't say much, but she was very polite." Mrs. Collins hesitated. "Sir, if I may, is everything all right?" Everything's fine, Dominic replied dismissively. You can go home now. The storm seems to be letting up. After Mrs. Collins left, Dominic decided to check on his unexpected guest. He told himself it was just to make sure she hadn't stolen anything, but deep down he knew there was something more drawing him to her. He knocked on the door of the blue room. When there was no answer, he knocked again, louder this time. Come, in a soft voice called. Dominic opened the door and froze. The woman standing by the window was nearly unrecognizable from the bedraggled figure he'd found outside his gates. Her dark hair, now clean and dry, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. Her face, free of dirt, revealed high cheekbones, full lips, and those same expressive eyes that had caught his attention earlier. She wore a simple white blouse and black pants that Mrs. Collins must have found, and though they were a bit too large, they couldn't hide her graceful figure. For the first time in years, Dominic Hale was genuinely speechless. "Thank you for your kindness," she said, breaking the silence. "I don't know what I would have done tonight if you hadn't stopped." Dominic cleared his throat. "Are you comfortable? Do you need anything else?" "No, this is more than I could have hoped for." She gestured to the elegant room with its four-poster bed and antique furniture. "It's been a long time since I've slept somewhere so nice." "You look different," Dominic said bluntly. A small smile touched her lips. "Amazing what soap and clean clothes can do. What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, something flashing in her eyes before she answered. Elena Munro." "How did you end up on the streets, Elena Munro?" Dominic asked, walking further into the room. Elena's posture stiffened. "It's a long story." "I have time," Dominic said, surprising himself again. Since when did he care about other people's stories? Elena moved away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed. "Sometimes life doesn't go as planned. One day you have everything, and the next—" She shrugged. "Everything's gone." There was something in her tone, a hint of education and refinement. That didn't match the image of a homeless woman. "You're not what I expected," Dominic admitted. "What did you expect?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "I don't know. Not you." Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. There was a connection between them that Dominic couldn't explain, a pull he hadn't felt in years, if ever. The moment was broken by a loud crash of thunder that made Elena jump. "You're safe here," Dominic found himself saying. "Get some rest. We can talk more in the morning." As he turned to leave, Eleanor called after him. "Mr. Hale, why did you really help me tonight?" Dominic paused at the door, considering the question. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Good night, Eleanor." He closed the door behind him, his mind racing. Who was this woman who had appeared out of nowhere on the worst night of the year? And why did he feel so drawn to her? The next morning, Dominic woke earlier than usual. After a quick shower and change, he headed downstairs, half expecting to find that Elena had disappeared in the night. Instead, he found her in the kitchen, talking with Mrs. Collins. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," Mrs. Collins greeted him. "Would you like your usual breakfast?" "Yes, thank you," he replied, his eyes on Elena. In the morning light, she looked even more striking. The clothes Mrs. Collins had given her fit better today, a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. "I hope you slept well," Dominic said as he sat at the kitchen island. "Better than I have in months," Elena admitted. "Thank you again for your hospitality." "Mr. Hale rarely brings guests home," Mrs. Collins remarked as she prepared coffee. Dominic shot her a warning look, which she pretended not to notice. "I won't impose on your kindness any longer," Elena said. "After breakfast, I'll be on my way." "Where will you go?" Dominic asked. Elena looked down at her hands. "I'll figure something out, I always do." Dominic found himself reluctant to let her leave. "Actually, I could use some help around here. Mrs. Collins has been saying she needs an assistant." Mrs. Collins nearly dropped the coffee pot. "I have?" "Yes," Dominic said firmly. "Remember our conversation last month?" Mrs. Collins, who had worked for Dominic long enough to know when to play along, nodded. "Oh yes, that conversation. An assistant would be very helpful." Eleanor looked between them, clearly not believing the charade. "Mr. Hale, I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept charity disguised as a job." "It's not charity," Dominic insisted. "You'd be earning your keep, room, board, and a salary." He wasn't sure why he was pushing so hard. but the thought of her returning to the streets bothered him more than it should. "You don't even know me," Elena pointed out. "I'm a good judge of character," Dominic replied. "It's how I built my business." Elena studied him for a long moment. What exactly would this job entail? Before Dominic could answer, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "I have to take this. Think about the offer. We'll discuss details when I get back." As he left the kitchen, he could hear Mrs. Collins explaining to Eleanor what her duties might be. Dominic walked to his study, wondering what had gotten into him. First, he brings a stranger into his home, and now he's offering her a job. It was completely out of character. The call was from James Whitaker, his chief financial officer. "Dominic, we have a problem. The Peterson deal is falling apart." "What?" "Why?" Dominic demanded, instantly switching to business mode. "Someone's been feeding them information about our financial vulnerabilities. They're using it to renegotiate terms." Dominic's grip tightened on the phone. "Find out who leaked the information, and schedule an emergency meeting with the board for this afternoon. I'll be there in an hour." When he returned to the kitchen, he found Elena helping Mrs. Collins with the dishes. She looked up when he entered. "I have to go into the office," Dominic said. "Business emergency. Have you thought about my offer?" Elena nodded. "If Mrs. Collins really needs the help, I'd be grateful for the opportunity." Mrs. Collins smiled. "I think we'll work well together." "Good, that's settled then," Dominic said, strangely pleased. "I'll be back this evening. We can discuss the details then." As he walked to the door, Elena followed him. "Mr. Hale," she said quietly, "I want you to know I won't stay longer than necessary. Once I get back on my feet, I'll move on." Something about her words disappointed him, but he nodded. "That's your choice." On the drive to the office, Dominic tried to focus on the business crisis at hand, but his thoughts kept returning to Elena. There was something about her, a mystery he wanted to solve. And for a man who built his life on control and predictability, this new feeling was both unsettling and exhilarating. Little did he know that Elena Monroe was hiding secrets that could threaten everything he had built, and that the simple act of bringing her into his home had set in motion events that would change his life forever. 2 weeks passed since Elena had moved into the Hale mansion. The arrangement had settled into an unexpected routine. Each morning, she would help Mrs. Collins with breakfast before Dominic came downstairs. They would share a brief meal, during which Dominic would read the newspaper while occasionally asking Elena questions about herself, questions she carefully deflected. On this particular morning, Dominic noticed Elena seemed distracted as she poured his coffee. "Is everything all right?" he asked, folding his newspaper. Elena smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be? You seem on edge today." Before she could respond, Mrs. Collins entered the kitchen. "Mr. Hale, Ms. Rebecca is here to see you." Elena's hand froze mid-air, coffee pot still tilted over Dominic's cup. "Rebecca?" Dominic frowned. "I wasn't expecting her." The sound of high heels clicking on marble flooring preceded the arrival of a tall, elegant blonde woman in her early 40s. Rebecca Winters swept into the kitchen like she owned it. Her designer dress and perfectly styled hair, a stark contrast to Elena's simple outfit. "Dominic." "Darling," Rebecca purred, leaning in to kiss his cheek. Her eyes flicked dismissively over Elena before returning to Dominic. "I've been trying to reach you for days." "I've been busy," Dominic replied, standing up. "What brings you here, Rebecca?" Rebecca smiled, a practiced gesture that showed off her perfect teeth. "Can't I visit my favorite ex-husband without an agenda?" Eleanor nearly dropped the coffee pot. Ex-husband? Dominic had never mentioned being married. "Elena," Dominic said, noticing her reaction, "this is Rebecca Winters, my ex-wife." Rebecca turned to Eleanor, assessing her with cold, calculating eyes. "And who might this be? New housekeeper?" "Elena is Mrs. Collins's assistant," Dominic said flatly. "Interesting," Rebecca replied, clearly not believing him. "Well, I need to speak with you privately, Dominic. Business matters." Dominic nodded. "We can talk in my study." He turned to Elena. "Would you mind bringing us some coffee?" "Of course, Mr. Hale," Elena replied, her voice professional despite the color rising in her cheeks. As Dominic led Rebecca out of the kitchen, Elena couldn't help but notice the possessive way the woman placed her hand on his arm. "Well, that was awkward," Mrs. Collins said once they were gone. "Who is she?" Elena asked, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Collins sighed. "Rebecca Winters. They were married for 3 years, divorced 4 years ago. She's the marketing director at Hale Industries." She gave Elena a knowing look. "They have a complicated relationship." "It's none of my business," Elena said quickly. Mrs. Collins hummed, unconvinced. "I'll prepare the coffee tray. You can bring it to the study." When Elena knocked on the study door a few minutes later, she heard raised voices from inside. She hesitated, not wanting to interrupt an argument. "You can't be serious, Dominic," Rebecca was saying. "The Whitaker Group is making a move against us, and you're distracted by some charity case you found on the street." "Keep your voice down," Dominic replied, his tone icy. "And my personal life is none of your concern anymore." "It is when it affects the company. Our company. My company," Dominic corrected. "You got your fair share in the divorce." Elena knocked. Louder, not wanting to hear more. "Come in," Dominic called. Elena entered with the coffee tray, keeping her eyes down as she placed it on the desk. "Thank you, Elena," Dominic said. Rebecca watched her with narrowed eyes. "That will be all," she said dismissively. Anger flashed through Elena at Rebecca's tone, but she maintained her composure. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Hale?" Dominic looked between the two women, aware of the tension. "No, thank you, Elena." As she closed the door behind her, Elena heard Rebecca say, "Really, Dominic? She's living in your house? What do you even know about her?" Elena moved quickly down the hallway, her heart pounding. Rebecca was right about one thing: Dominic knew almost nothing about her. And that was exactly how it needed to stay. Later that afternoon, Dominic found Elena in the garden, reading a book beneath the shade of an old oak tree. He stood watching her for a moment, struck by how naturally she seemed to fit into his world, despite having been there such a short time. "I hope Rebecca didn't make you uncomfortable," he said, approaching. Elena looked up, closing her book. "Not at all. She seems protective of you." Dominic laughed without humor. "Rebecca is protective of her interests, nothing more." He sat down beside her on the stone bench. "I should have mentioned her before. We've been divorced for years, but we still work together." "You don't owe me explanations, Mr. Hale." "Dominic," he corrected. "I think after 2 weeks you can call me by my first name." A small smile touched Elena's lips. "Dominic." The way she said his name sent an unexpected warmth through him. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Rebecca seemed concerned about your company, Elena finally said. "Something about the Whitaker Group?" Dominic's expression darkened. "James Whitaker. He used to be my friend and business partner when I started Hale Industries. Now he's trying to take over my company." He shook his head. "I shouldn't be bothering you with this." "It's not bothering me," Elena said softly. "Sometimes it helps to talk about your problems." Dominic looked at her, really looked at her. In the 2 weeks she'd been here, she'd slipped into his life so seamlessly, it was hard to remember a time before her. Yet she remained a mystery. Every personal question he asked was deflected with a vague answer or a change of subject. "Elena," he said slowly, "who are you?" "Really?" Her body tensed, but her face remained calm. "I told you, I'm just someone who had a run of bad luck. I don't believe that. Your manners, your speech, the way you carry yourself, you weren't always homeless." Elena stood up abruptly. "We all have pasts we'd rather not discuss." Before Dominic could respond, Frank appeared at the garden entrance. "Mr. Hale, Mr. Reynolds is here to see you." Dominic frowned. "Victor, he's supposed to be in Europe." A tall, distinguished man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes strode into the garden. "Dominic, sorry to drop in unannounced, but I just got back from London and heard the news." "What news?" Dominic asked, standing to shake his old friend's hand. Victor, Reynolds, Dominic's lawyer and one of his oldest friends, glanced at Elena. "Private business matters. Could we speak alone?" "Of course," Elena said quickly. "I should help Mrs. Collins with dinner anyway." As she walked away, she felt Victor's eyes on her back, assessing and suspicious. Inside the house, Elena tried to focus on helping Mrs. Collins, but her mind kept drifting to Dominic's question. Who was she really? The truth was too dangerous for both of them. Later that evening, after a tense dinner where Victor had watched her every move, Eleanor retired to her room early. She was sitting by the window when a knock came at her door. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Collins. Instead, Dominic entered, his expression troubled. "We need to talk." Elena's stomach knotted. "What about?" "Victor showed me something interesting today," Dominic said, closing the door behind him. "A newspaper article from 6 months ago." Eleanor's hands gripped the arms of her chair. "Oh?" "It was about the disappearance of a woman named Eleanor Blackwood," Dominic continued, watching her face carefully. "Wife of real estate developer Maxwell Blackwood. She vanished without a trace after her husband was arrested for fraud and money laundering." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face but remained silent. "The article included a photo," Dominic said, pulling a folded newspaper clipping from his pocket. "She looked remarkably like you." He placed the clipping on the table between them. Elena glanced down at her own face, staring back at her, smiling at a charity gala, draped in diamonds and standing beside a handsome, sinister-looking man. "Is this you, Elena?" Dominic asked quietly. "Are you Elena Blackwood?" For a long moment, Elena said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "Yes." Dominic sat down across from her. "Why did you run? Were you involved in your husband's crimes?" "No," Elena exclaimed, her composure finally breaking. "I knew nothing about what Maxwell was doing until the FBI showed up at our door." Her eyes filled with tears. "But that didn't matter to the press or to his enemies. I was guilty by association." "So you ran." Elena stood, moving to the window. "After Maxwell was arrested, I started receiving threats. Someone believed I knew where Maxwell had hidden millions of dollars." She turned to face Dominic. "But I didn't know anything. Maxwell kept me in the dark about everything." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Elena laughed bitterly. "Maxwell had police officers, judges, even FBI agents on his payroll. I didn't know who to trust." She wrapped her arms around herself. "So I disappeared, changed my name back to my mother's maiden name, Monroe, cut and dyed my hair, left everything behind." Dominic studied her, his face unreadable. "And you've been on the run for 6 months?" Elena nodded. "The money I had access to ran out quickly. I sold my jewelry, stayed in cheap motels, kept moving." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Until that night in the rain, when you found me." "Why? Tell me all this now. Why not continue lying?" "Because I'm tired of running," Elena admitted, "and because I trust you." The vulnerability in her eyes stirred something in Dominic's chest. Before he could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "I have to take this. It's Victor." Eleanor tensed. "Does he know who I am?" "He suspects," Dominic admitted. "But he hasn't gone to the authorities yet. He wanted to talk to me first." Flashed across Elena's face. "I should leave. I've put you in an impossible position." "No," Dominic said firmly. "Stay here. Let me handle Victor." As he left to take the call, Elena sank onto the bed, her mind racing. She should pack her few belongings and disappear again before she brought trouble to Dominic's door. But the thought of leaving him created an unexpected ache in her chest. When had this man, this stranger who had taken her in on a rainy night, become so important to her? Dominic returned 20 minutes later, his expression grim. "Victor wants to meet with you. He says he can help, but he needs to hear your side of the story first." "Can he be trusted?" Elena asked. "Victor and I have been friends for 30 years, Dominic replied. "He's a good man, even if he's suspicious by nature." He sat beside her on the bed. "But the decision is yours, Elena. If you want to leave, I won't stop you." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the connection between them intensified. Without thinking, Elena reached out and placed her hand over his. "If I stay," she said softly, "I could be putting you in danger. The people looking for me, they're dangerous." Dominic turned his hand to clasp hers. "I'm not exactly defenseless, Elena. I've made my share of enemies in business. I know how to handle dangerous people." "Why would you risk it? For someone you barely know?" Dominic's gaze softened. Because in the 2 weeks you've been here, my house has felt more like a home than it has in years. The admission clearly surprised him as much as it did her. For a moment they sat in silence, their hands still joined. "I'll meet with Victor," Elena finally said. "But after that, I need to decide what's best. For both of us." Dominic nodded, though something in his eyes suggested he had already decided. He wanted her to stay. The next morning, Victor arrived early. The three of them sat in Dominic's study, where Elena told her story from the beginning. How she had met Maxwell Blackwood, their whirlwind romance and marriage, the gradual realization that her husband wasn't the man she thought he was, and finally, the morning the FBI had raided their home. "I truly didn't know about Maxwell's illegal activities," Elena insisted. "He kept me isolated, controlled all our finances, charmed all my concerns away." Victor listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. When she finished, he sat back in his chair. "I believe you," he said finally, "and I think I can help you clear your name. The FBI has been looking for you as a witness, not a suspect." Hope flickered in Elena's eyes. "Really?" "But," Victor continued, "there's a complication. According to my sources, one of Maxwell's former associates believes you have access to accounts holding millions in stolen funds. He's the one who's been looking for you." "Who is it?" Dominic asked sharply. Victor's expression was grave. "James Whittaker." Dominic stood abruptly. "Whittaker? My Whittaker?" "The same," Victor confirmed. "It seems Maxwell Blackwood was one of his silent investors. When Maxwell went down, Whittaker lost millions. He believes Elena knows where the rest of the money is hidden." Elena's face had gone pale. "That's why he's trying to take over your company. He must have found out I'm here." Dominic paced the room, his mind racing. "But how would he know?" "Rebecca," Elena said suddenly. "She saw me yesterday. If she and Whittaker are in contact—" "Rebecca wouldn't," Dominic began, then stopped. "Actually, she might. She's been pushing for a merger with Whittaker Group for months." Victor stood up. "We need to move quickly. I'll contact my friend at the FBI, arrange for a protected interview where you can tell them what you know, Elena. In the meantime, you should both be careful." After Victor left, Dominic turned to Elena. "I won't let Whittaker get to you." "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Elena said, running a hand through her hair. "I've dragged you into my mess." "No," Dominic said firmly. "Whittaker was already my problem. You've just helped me understand why he's been so determined to take over my company." He moved closer to her. "We'll face this together." The intensity in his voice made Elena look up at him. In his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time, someone who truly cared about her, not what she could do for them. "Together," she repeated softly. Neither of them noticed Mrs. Collins at the partially open door, her expression worried as she quietly closed it and hurried away to make a phone call. A call that would set in motion events that would test their newfound alliance in ways they couldn't imagine. The morning after Eleanor's revelation, Dominic woke early. Sleep had been elusive, his mind racing with thoughts of Elena's story and Whittaker's connection to Maxwell Blackwood. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs, surprised to find Mrs. Collins already in the kitchen, looking tense. "Morning, Mrs. Collins, you're up early." She jumped slightly at his voice. "Oh, Mr. Hale, yes, I couldn't sleep. Is everything all right?" Mrs. Collins avoided his eyes. "Of course, sir. Just worried about all this trouble with Miss Elena." Something in her tone made Dominic pause. In the 15 years Mrs. Collins had worked for him, she'd never been one to hide her thoughts. "Mrs. Collins," he said carefully, "is there something you're not telling me?" Before she could answer, Eleanor entered the kitchen. She'd clearly slept, as poorly as Dominic, dark circles under her eyes despite her attempt to conceal them. "Good morning," she said softly. Mrs. Collins busied herself with the coffee pot. "I'll leave you two to talk. Breakfast will be ready in 20 minutes. As she hurried out, Elena raised an eyebrow. "She seems upset." "Yes," Dominic agreed, watching the door close behind his housekeeper. "She does." He turned back to Eleanor, struck again by how much she'd come to mean to him in such a short time. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," Elena admitted with a small smile. "But I've also been worse. At least now I don't have to hide the truth from you anymore. Dominic reached across the table and took her hand. We'll figure this out. Victor is meeting with his FBI contact this morning. Elena's fingers tightened around his. Thank you for believing me, for not turning me away when you learned who I really am. I don't care what name you use, Dominic said. It's who you are that matters to me. The intensity in his gaze made Elena's heart race. In that moment, she realized how deeply she had come to care for this man who had rescued her from the rain and given her more than just shelter. He'd given her hope. The sound of the doorbell broke the spell between them. Frank's voice called from the hallway. Mr. Hale, there are some gentlemen here to see you. They say it's urgent. Dominic frowned. I'm not expecting anyone. When they walked into the foyer, they found two stern-looking men in dark suits standing with Frank. Dominic Hale? The taller one asked, showing a badge. I'm Agent Phillips with the FBI. This is Agent Turner. We're here about Elena Blackwood. Eleanor froze beside Dominic. The agent's eyes shifted to her. Mrs. Blackwood, Agent Phillips said with a nod. We've been looking for you for quite some time. How did you find me? Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible. We received an anonymous tip, Agent Turner replied. We need you to come with us to answer some questions. Dominic stepped forward. My lawyer, Victor Reynolds, was supposed to arrange a meeting. He said he was contacting the FBI today. We're not aware of any arrangement with Mr. Reynolds, Agent Phillips said, but we can sort that out at the office. Mrs. Blackwood, please get your things. You'll be coming with us. She's not going anywhere until I speak with Victor, Dominic insisted, pulling out his phone. Agent Phillips moved his jacket aside, revealing his holstered gun. This isn't a request, Mr. Hale. Please don't interfere in a federal investigation. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Dominic's arm. It's okay, I'll go with them. Call Victor and have him meet me there. The look they shared spoke volumes, trust, fear, and something deeper neither was ready to name. I'll handle this, Dominic promised quietly. I won't let anything happen to you. As the agents escorted Elena out to their waiting car, Dominic noticed Mrs. Collins watching from the hallway, her expression a mix of guilt and worry. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. It was you, he said, his voice cold. You called the FBI. Mrs. Collins wrung her hands. I was worried about you, Mr. Hale. Getting involved with a fugitive, it could ruin everything you've worked for. Who put you up to this? Dominic demanded. Was it Rebecca or Whitaker? Mrs. Collins looked down. Ms. Rebecca called yesterday. She said she was concerned about your welfare. Said that woman was dangerous, using you for protection. Anger surged through Dominic. You've worked for me for 15 years, and you went behind my back because Rebecca manipulated you. I thought I was protecting you, Mrs. Collins said, tears in her eyes. I'm sorry. Dominic strode past her without another word, already dialing Victor's number. Victor, they've taken Elena, he said as soon as his friend answered. 2 FBI agents just showed up at my house. What? Victor sounded genuinely shocked. That's impossible. My contact at the bureau promised to wait until we arranged a formal interview. A chill ran down Dominic's spine. What if they weren't real FBI agents? Description, Victor demanded. As Dominic described the men, Victor's silence on the other end confirmed his worst fears. My contact says they don't have agents matching that description in your area, Victor finally said. Dominic, those weren't FBI agents. Whitaker, Dominic growled. It has to be. Get your real FBI contacts to my house right now. I'm going after Eleanor. Hanging up, Dominic rushed to his study and unlocked the safe hidden behind a painting. He removed a small handgun, a precaution from years of high-stakes business deals with unsavory characters. He hoped he wouldn't need it, but he wasn't taking chances with Elena's life at stake. Frank, he called, striding back to the foyer. Which way did they go? North, toward the highway, Frank replied. Sir, what's happening? Those weren't FBI agents, Dominic said grimly. Get the car, we're going after them. As they sped down the driveway, Dominic's phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown. Hale, he answered sharply. Hello, Dominic. James Whitaker's smooth voice came through the speaker. Looking for something. Dominic's grip tightened on the phone. Where is she, Whitaker? Safe. For now. Whitaker chuckled. She's quite beautiful, your Elena. Or should I say Maxwell's. Helena? I can see why you've been hiding her. If you hurt her, now, Whitaker interrupted. Let's be businessmen about this. I have something you want. You have something I want. What do you want? Dominic demanded, though he already knew the answer. Your company, of course. Sign it over to me and Elena walks away unharmed. Whitaker's voice hardened. Refuse, and I'll have to assume she's been hiding Maxwell's money all along. My associates can be very persuasive when extracting information. Dominic felt sick at the implied threat. I want proof she's alive. Of course, there was rustling, then Eleanor's voice came on the line. Dominic, don't do it. Don't give him what he wants. I'm not worth your company. Eleanor, Dominic breathed, relief washing over him at the sound of her voice. Are you hurt? No, Her voice cut off as Whitaker came back on the line. Satisfied? You have 1 hour to get the transfer papers ready. I'll text you the location for the exchange. The call ended, and Dominic slammed his fist against the car door. Should we call the police, sir? Frank asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. No time, Dominic replied, and we can't risk Elena's safety. Take me back to the house. I need to get those papers. When they returned, Victor was waiting in the driveway with another man. Dominic, this is Agent Martinez, FBI. The real FBI. The agent stepped forward. Mr. Hale, we believe Elena Blackwood has been kidnapped by associates of James Whitaker. We've been building a case against Whitaker for months. He wants my company in exchange for Elena's life, Dominic said. He's given me an hour. Agent Martinez frowned. We can't let you make that exchange. Whitaker is dangerous. He's connected to 3 disappearances already, people who knew too much about his dealings with Maxwell Blackwood. I'm not letting Elena become the 4th, Dominic said firmly. We'll set up a sting operation, Agent Martinez offered, but we need time. Time is the one thing we don't have, Dominic snapped. His phone buzzed with a text, an address on the outskirts of town, an abandoned warehouse. Typical. That's the location, Dominic said, showing Agent Martinez. You have 30 minutes to get your team in place. I'm going in with or without you. Back in Whitaker's warehouse, Eleanor tested the ropes binding her wrists to the chair. They were tight, cutting into her skin when she pulled too hard. The room was dimly lit, with concrete floors and metal walls that echoed every sound. James Whitaker paced in front of her, checking his watch. He was tall and lean, with silver-streaked dark hair and cold eyes that reminded her too much of Maxwell. Your boyfriend is taking his time, Whitaker remarked. Maybe you don't mean as much to him as I thought. He's smarter than you give him credit for, Elena replied calmly. He won't just hand over his company without guarantees. Whitaker smiled, a predatory expression that sent chills down her spine. Oh, I'm counting on his intelligence. It's what's kept Hale Industries so valuable. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. But I'm also counting on his feelings for you. Men in love make stupid decisions. He's not in love with me, Elena said, though her heart raced at the thought. No? Whitaker laughed. I've known Dominic Hale for 20 years. I've never seen him look twice at a woman since his divorce from Rebecca. Yet here he is, risking everything for you. He straightened up. Speaking of Rebecca, she sends her regards. She's been quite helpful in all this. She told Mrs. Collins to call the FBI, Eleanor realized aloud. She thought they would actually come. Whitaker shrugged. But I have better connections. My men got to you first. A door banged open somewhere in the warehouse, and one of Whitaker's men entered the room. Boss, Hale just pulled up outside. Alone, like you said. Whitaker grinned. Perfect. Bring him in. When Dominic was led into the room, his eyes immediately found Elena's. The relief and concern in his gaze made her throat tight with emotion. Are you hurt? He asked, taking a step toward her before one of Whitaker's men blocked his path. I'm okay, she assured him. Whitaker stepped between them. How touching. Did you bring the papers? Dominic held up a manila envelope. Everything you need to take. Control of Hale Industries, signed and notarized. Hand them over, Whitaker demanded, reaching for the envelope. Dominic pulled it back. Release Elena first. Whitaker's smile faded. That's not how this works. The papers. Now. For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Dominic slowly extended the envelope. As Whitaker reached for it, The lights suddenly went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. The sound of breaking glass and shouts filled the room. "FBI, everybody down," a voice commanded through a megaphone. Chaos erupted. In the darkness, Elena felt someone cutting the ropes on her wrists. "It's me," Dominic whispered in her ear. "Can you walk?" "Yes," she breathed, relief flooding through her. He helped her to her feet, and they moved quickly through the darkness, guided by the dim emergency lights that had activated. Behind them, Eleanor heard Whitaker shouting orders to his men, followed by the sound of gunshots. "This way," Dominic urged, pulling her toward a side exit. They had almost reached the door when a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. Rebecca Winters, her face twisted with rage, pointed a small pistol at them. "Going somewhere?" she asked, her voice cold. "Rebecca, don't do this," Dominic warned, pushing Elena slightly behind him. "Do you know what I had to do to help set this up?" Rebecca hissed. "The humiliation of pretending to still want you, of watching you fall for this gold digger?" "I never wanted your money," Eleanor said quietly. "I never wanted any of this." Rebecca laughed bitterly. "Oh, please, Maxwell Blackwood's wife? You're just as bad as he was." "Rebecca," Dominic said, taking a careful step forward. "The FBI is here, it's over. Put the gun down before you make things worse for yourself." "Worse?" Rebecca's hand trembled. "Do you know what Whitaker promised me if I helped him get your company? A seat on the board, recognition, everything you denied me when we were married." "I never denied you anything," Dominic replied. "You wanted more than I could give. Not money, not position, but parts of myself I couldn't surrender." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "And now you're giving those parts to her?" She shifted the gun, aiming directly at Elena. "I don't think so. Everything happened in an instant." Rebecca's finger tightened on the trigger. Dominic lunged forward, pushing the gun upward as it fired. The bullet hit the ceiling as they struggled. Elena grabbed a metal pipe from nearby and swung, catching Rebecca in the side. She crumpled with a cry of pain, the gun skittering across the floor. Dominic kicked it away, then pulled Elena toward the exit again. "Come on!" Outside, the night air was filled with flashing police lights and shouting voices. Agent Martinez spotted them and rushed over. "Are you both all right?" he asked, scanning them for injuries. "We're fine," Dominic replied, his arm firmly around Elena's waist. "Whitaker and Rebecca Winters are still inside. They're both armed." Martinez nodded to his team. "We'll handle it from here. Get to safety." As they walked toward Dominic's car, Elena suddenly stumbled, her adrenaline fading. "Hey," Dominic said softly, steadying her. "I've got you." Elena looked up at him, seeing the worry and care in his eyes. "You risked everything for me today." "Not everything," Dominic smiled. "The papers I gave Whitaker were fakes. Victor's idea." Laugh bubbled up from Elena's chest, a release of tension and fear. "You're amazing." Dominic's expression grew serious. "I realized something today, Elena. When I thought I might lose you..." He paused, searching for words. "These past weeks with you have changed me, changed everything." In the glow of the police lights, with the sounds of justice being served in the background, Elena reached up and touched his face. "I feel the same way," she whispered. Their lips met in a kiss that felt both like coming home and the start of an adventure. When they finally pulled apart, Dominic rested his forehead against hers. "Come on," he said, "let's go home." As they drove away, Elena knew that her running days were over. For the first time in months, she had something worth staying for, someone worth building a future with. But as Agent Martinez had warned them before they left, the danger wasn't entirely past. Whitaker had connections, even from prison, and Maxwell Blackwood still had secrets that could reach out and threaten their newfound happiness. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least they would face it together. 3 months had passed since the warehouse confrontation. Fall had given way to winter, coating Dominic's estate in a blanket of pristine snow. Inside the mansion, warmth and light pushed back against the early darkness of December evenings. Elena stood by the living room window, watching snowflakes dance in the glow of the outdoor lights. So much had changed in such a short time. James. Whitaker and Rebecca were both in custody awaiting trial, facing charges of kidnapping, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The FBI had used Elena's testimony to build a stronger case against Maxwell Blackwood, who had recently been sentenced to 20 years in prison, and then there was her relationship with Dominic. What had begun as an act of charity on a rainy night had blossomed into something neither of them had expected, a deep, abiding love that grew stronger each day. "Penny, for your thoughts," Dominic said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Elena leaned back against his chest. "I was just thinking about how different my life is now compared to a year ago. Last Christmas, I was hosting a party for 300 of Maxwell's business associates, wearing a dress that cost more than some people's cars and feeling completely empty inside." Dominic kissed the top of her head. "And this Christmas?" Elena turned in his arms to face him. "This Christmas, I'm exactly where I want to be, with the person I want to be with." The smile that lit up Dominic's face was something that still amazed Elena. When she'd first met him, he'd rarely smiled. Now it happened several times a day, usually because of something she said or did. "Speaking of Christmas," Dominic said, "we should finish decorating the tree. Mrs. Collins brought up the last box of ornaments before she left. After the incident with the FBI tip, Mrs. Collins had offered her resignation. Dominic had initially refused to accept it, understanding that she had been manipulated by Rebecca. But the trust between them had been damaged, and eventually they had agreed she would stay only until after the holidays, then retire with a generous package. Elena and Dominic settled on the floor beside the massive Christmas tree, sorting through ornaments. Many had stories behind them, childhood memories, travel souvenirs, gifts from friends and family. "What about your family traditions?" Dominic asked, hanging a crystal snowflake on a branch. "You never talk about your family." Elena's hands stilled on a red glass ball. "There's not much to tell. My parents died in a car accident when I was in college. I was an only child. After that, holidays were just something to get through." Dominic placed his hand over hers. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "It's okay," Elena assured him with a small smile. "It was a long time ago, and meeting Maxwell right after graduation, well, he became my world, until I realized what kind of world that was." "You deserved better," Dominic said, his voice low and intense. "You deserve someone who sees you for who you really are, who values your strength and kindness." "Someone like you?" Elena asked softly. Instead of answering, Dominic reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out a small velvet box. Elena's breath caught in her throat. "I had planned to do this on Christmas Eve," Dominic said, suddenly looking nervous. "Had it all arranged, dinner reservation, champagne, the works. But sitting here with you now, talking about family and traditions." He opened the box, revealing a stunning diamond ring that somehow managed to be both elegant and understated. "I don't want to wait any longer." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as Dominic took her hand. "Eleanor Monroe, or Blackwood, or whatever name you choose, I love you. These past months have shown me what real happiness feels like. Will you marry me?" Before Eleanor could answer, the doorbell rang, its chime echoing through the quiet house. "Ignore it," Dominic murmured, not taking his eyes off her. The bell rang again, more insistent this time. Elena squeezed his hand. "It's okay. Whoever it is, they'll go away." But the ringing continued, followed by loud knocking. With a frustrated sigh, Dominic stood. "I'll get rid of them. Don't move." Eleanor smiled. "I'll be right here." As Dominic disappeared into the foyer, Eleanor gazed at the ring still nestled in its velvet box. Her heart felt so full it might burst. After everything she'd been through, all the fear and uncertainty, she had found something real and true with Dominic. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the voices at first. It was only when they grew louder that she realized something was wrong. Rising to her feet, Elena moved toward the foyer. "You have no right to be here," Dominic was saying, his voice cold with anger. "I want you to leave, now." "Not without speaking to my wife first," a male voice replied, a voice that sent ice through Eleanor's veins. She froze in the doorway, unable to believe her eyes. Standing in the entryway, looking thinner but just as arrogant as ever, was Maxwell. "Blackwood, hello, Eleanor," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "You look well." "Maxwell," she whispered. "How are you here? You're supposed to be in prison." Released on appeal, Maxwell replied smoothly. My new legal team found some irregularities in the prosecution's case. I'm a free man, at least until the new trial. Dominic moved to Elena's side, placing a protective arm around her waist. You need to leave, Blackwood. Elena doesn't want to see you. Maxwell's eyes narrowed at Dominic's gesture. Is that true, Elena? Have you replaced me so quickly with... His gaze swept dismissively over Dominic. This? Anger sparked through Eleanor's shock. Don't you dare speak to him that way. Dominic is twice the man you'll ever be. I see, Maxwell said coldly. Well, regardless of your current situation, we have matters to discuss, legal matters. We're still married, Eleanor. The words hit her like a physical blow. In all the chaos of the past year, with running and hiding and then building a new life with Dominic, she had never formally divorced Maxwell. I think it's time you left, Dominic said, stepping forward. Elena will contact you through her lawyer. If there's anything to discuss, Maxwell's smile turned predatory. Her lawyer? I think you mean our lawyer. Community property laws are quite clear. Half of everything is mine, including the settlement she'll receive from Whitaker's estate after. His conviction. He looked directly at Elena. Unless, of course, you'd like to tell me where the rest of the money is. There is no money, Eleanor insisted. I never had access to your accounts, you know that. So you keep saying, Maxwell replied. Yet somehow you've landed on your feet quite nicely. His gaze moved pointedly around the mansion's elegant foyer. That's enough, Dominic said sharply. Get out before I call the police. Maxwell raised his hands in mock surrender. No need for that, I'm going. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, holding it out to Elena. When you're ready to discuss terms, call my new attorney. Don't wait too long. The press would love to hear about the wife of a convicted fraudster shacking up with another wealthy businessman so quickly. People might start to wonder if you were involved all along. Elena didn't take the card. Maxwell shrugged and placed it on the hall table. Think about it, Elena. You know how persuasive I can be when I want something. With one last cold smile, he turned and walked out the door. The moment it closed behind him, Elena's knees buckled. Dominic caught her and guided her to a nearby chair. He's out, she whispered, shaking. He's really out. It's okay, Dominic said, kneeling in front of her. He can't hurt you anymore. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. You don't know Maxwell. He never lets go of what he considers his, and he doesn't make empty threats. We'll call Victor first thing in the morning, Dominic assured her. He'll know what to do about the divorce and any other legal issues. Elena nodded, but the joy of their earlier moment had been shattered. The engagement ring sat forgotten on the coffee table by the Christmas tree. Seeing her expression, Dominic took her hands in his. Hey, look at me. Nothing has changed. I love you. Maxwell Blackwood doesn't get to take that away from us, Elena. Tried to smile, but the fear wouldn't let go. I love you too, that's why I'm scared. Everyone I've ever loved, I've lost. My parents, my friends, when Maxwell isolated me. I can't lose you too. You won't, Dominic promised. We're in this together, remember? That night, Eleanor barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, made her tense with fear. Beside her, Dominic slept fitfully, his arm protectively around her waist even in sleep as dawn broke. She carefully slipped out of bed, wrapped herself in a robe and headed downstairs. Coffee would help clear her head. She needed to think. In the kitchen, she was surprised to find Victor already sitting at the island, a laptop open in front of him. Victor, what are you doing here so early? Dominic called me last night after you fell asleep, Victor explained. Told me about Maxwell's visit. Elena sighed, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Of course he did. He's worried about you, Victor said. So am I. Maxwell Blackwood is dangerous, especially now that he's desperate. What can we do? Elena asked, sitting across from him. Victor turned his laptop to show her. I've been researching. The good news is that Maxwell's release is temporary. The appeal was based on a technicality, but the evidence against him is solid. He'll go back to prison eventually. And the bad news. The divorce could be complicated. As he pointed out, you're still legally married, and without a prenuptial agreement, Elena groaned. He could claim half of everything I have, which, legally speaking, isn't much, Victor pointed out. Everything. Here belongs to Dominic. That's not the point, Elena said. Maxwell doesn't actually care about money from me. He wants the money he hid before his arrest. Money I know nothing about. This is just his way of putting pressure on me. Victor studied her for a moment. Elena, is there any chance, any possibility, at all that Maxwell might have hidden information somewhere you would have access to? A safe deposit box, a storage unit, even a digital account? Elena started to shake her head, then paused. There was our vacation house in the Berkshires. Maxwell bought it as a surprise for our first anniversary. It was in my name for tax purposes, but I only went there a few times. He said he used it for business retreats. Victor's eyes lit up. Was the property seized when Maxwell was arrested? I don't know, Elena admitted. I never thought about it after I ran. I'll look into it right away, Victor said, already typing. Footsteps on the stairs announced Dominic's arrival. He looked tired, but determined as he entered the kitchen. I see Victor's brought you up to speed, he said, kissing Elena's forehead, before pouring his own coffee. We might have a lead, Victor told him. A vacation property in Elena's name. Dominic nodded. Good. In the meantime, I've made some calls. I've hired additional security for the estate and arranged for a bodyguard for Elena. A bodyguard? Elena protested. Dominic, that's too much. It's not enough, Dominic replied firmly. Maxwell threatened you. I'm not taking any chances. Before Elena could argue further, Victor's phone rang. He answered it, his expression growing increasingly serious as he listened. I understand. Yes, we'll be careful. He hung up and looked at them grimly. That was my contact at the FBI. Maxwell made bail yesterday, but there's more. The night before his release, James Whittaker was found dead in his cell. Apparent suicide, but they're investigating. Suicide, Dominic repeated skeptically. Whittaker wouldn't kill himself. He was too arrogant, too sure he'd beat the charges. Exactly, Victor agreed. And here's the troubling part. Whittaker left a note claiming he and Maxwell had hidden millions in cryptocurrency. The kind of funds that could help someone disappear permanently. Elena felt cold all over. If Maxwell has access to that kind of money, he has no reason to stay and fight the charges, Dominic finished her thought. He could be planning to run. But not without trying to get revenge first, Victor added, looking at Elena. Dominic's phone buzzed with a text. He read it and frowned. A security team is in place. They want to meet us to go over protocols. The next few days passed in a tense blur. Elena chafed under the constant presence of her bodyguard, a former military man named Davis, who followed her everywhere on the estate. Dominic was tied up with emergency meetings at Hale Industries, dealing with the fallout from Whittaker's death and its impact on their planned acquisition of Whittaker Group. Victor's investigation into the Berkshires property revealed it had indeed been overlooked in the initial asset seizure, possibly because it was in Elena's name rather than Maxwell's. It remained empty but untouched, all utilities still connected and paid automatically from an account linked to Elena's name, an account she hadn't even known existed. 5 days after Maxwell's visit, Elena made a decision. She found Dominic in his study, reviewing contracts. I need to go to the Berkshires house, she announced without preamble. Dominic looked up, surprised. Now? In the middle of winter? If there's any evidence of Maxwell's hidden assets, it would be there, Eleanor explained. Victor thinks so too. And I can't keep living like this, jumping at shadows, waiting for Maxwell to make another move. Dominic set down his pen. It's too dangerous. Let the FBI handle it. They need a warrant, which could take days, and Maxwell could be watching them. Elena sat on the edge of his desk. But he might not be watching me as closely. He thinks I'm too afraid to act. You're proposing a trap, Dominic realized. Elena nodded. I go to the house, ostensibly to collect personal belongings, if Maxwell follows me there. The FBI can catch him in the act, Dominic finished. It's too risky. It's our best chance, Elena argued, and I'll have Davis with me, plus whatever additional security you want to arrange. Dominic stood, pacing the room. I don't like it. I don't either, Elena admitted. But I want this over. I want to be free of Maxwell, of the past. She crossed to him, placing her hands on his chest. "I want to say yes to your proposal and start our life together without this shadow hanging over us." Dominic's expression softened. "You were going to say yes?" Eleanor smiled. "I still am, once this is finished." Their lips met in a kiss that conveyed all the love and worry and hope between them. "Okay," Dominic finally agreed, "but I'm coming with you." 2 days later, their plan was in motion. The FBI had been quietly informed and were ready to move at a moment's notice. Eleanor and Dominic, accompanied by Davis and another security officer, made the 3-hour drive to the Berkshires in a purposely obvious manner, even stopping for lunch in a public restaurant where they were recognized by other patrons. The vacation house was a beautiful lodge-style retreat, nestled among pine trees now covered in snow. As Davis did a security sweep of the perimeter, Eleanor unlocked the front door with the key Victor had obtained from the property management company. Inside, the house was cold but immaculate, maintained regularly by a cleaning service. Elena moved through the spaces slowly, memories washing. Over her, memories of a time when she had believed in her marriage, before she understood the kind of man Maxwell truly was. Where would he hide something important? Dominic asked, watching her carefully. Elena thought for a moment. His office. It was the one room he didn't like me to spend time in. The office was at the back of the house, a masculine space with dark wood and leather furniture. Elena stood in the doorway scanning the room. "The safe," she said suddenly. "Behind that painting." Dominic moved to a large landscape painting on the wall and lifted it away. Behind it was a wall safe with a digital keypad. "Do you know the combination?" he asked. Elena shook her head. "No, but..." She thought back to Maxwell's patterns, his habits. "Try my birthday. It would be just like him to use something so obvious yet personal." Dominic entered the numbers. The safe remained locked. "What about your anniversary?" he suggested. That didn't work either. Eleanor frowned, thinking harder. "The day we met," she said suddenly. "Maxwell always said it was the luckiest day of his life." Dominic entered the date. With a soft beep, the safe unlocked. Inside was a single USB drive and a folder of documents. Elena took them both with shaking hands. "This could be it," she whispered. Before they could examine the contents, Davis burst into the room. "Someone's coming up the drive. Black SUV, tinted windows." Dominic moved quickly to the window. "It's him, Maxwell." "The FBI team is 3 minutes out," Davis reported, checking his phone. "We need to stall him." Elena squared her shoulders. "I'll talk to him. He won't expect me to confront him directly." "Elena, no," Dominic protested. "It's too dangerous." "Trust me," she said. "I know how to handle Maxwell." Before Dominic could stop her, Elena was moving toward the front door, the USB drive clutched in her hand. She stepped onto the porch just as Maxwell was getting out of his car. He smiled when he saw her. "Eleanor, I had a feeling you might come here." "It's over, Maxwell," she called. "I found it, all of it." Maxwell's smile faltered slightly. "Found what, darling?" Eleanor held up the USB drive. "Everything. The accounts, the transactions with Whitaker, all of it. The FBI is on their way." Maxwell's expression hardened. "Give that to me now." "Or what?" Elena challenged, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "You'll kill me like you killed Whitaker." "I didn't kill James," Maxwell said, climbing the steps to the porch. "He outlived his usefulness, that's all. But you, Elena, you're still useful to me." "Don't come any closer," Elena warned, backing up toward the door where she knew Dominic and Davis were waiting. "It's over, Maxwell. You've lost." Maxwell's face contorted with rage. "I never lose," he snarled, lunging for her. The door burst open behind Elena as Dominic rushed out. At the same moment, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Maxwell froze, then turned to run back to his car. He made it halfway down the steps before FBI agents swarmed the property, weapons drawn. "Maxwell Blackwood," Agent Martinez called through a megaphone. "You're under arrest for the murder of James Whitaker and violation of your bail conditions. Put your hands up and get on the ground." For a moment it seemed Maxwell might try to run anyway. Then, slowly, he raised his hands and sank to his knees. In the snow, as the agents moved in to arrest him, Eleanor felt Dominic's arms wrap around her from behind. "It's really over," she whispered, watching as Maxwell was handcuffed and led away. He didn't look back at her once. "It's over," Dominic confirmed, turning her to face him. "And now, Elena Monroe, I believe we have an important question to revisit." Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the velvet box she had last seen on their coffee table before Maxwell's intrusion. Dropping to one knee in the snow, he opened it to reveal the diamond ring. "I'm asking you again, with no interruptions this time," he said, his eyes filled with love. "Will you marry me?" With Maxwell being placed in the back of an FBI vehicle, behind them, with the evidence that would ensure he never bothered them again secure in her hand, Eleanor finally felt truly free. Free to love, free to dream, free to build a future with this man who had seen beyond her circumstances to who she really was. "Yes," she said, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you." As Dominic slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the snow-covered landscape. It was a new beginning, a fresh start. And this time, Elena knew it was real. A love built not on illusions or manipulations, but on truth, trust, and the kind of understanding that only comes when someone sees beyond the surface to the heart within.